The committee will now come to order. Today we welcome Kevin McAleenan, the Acting Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, along with Chip Fulgham, the Acting Undersecretary for Management. Thank you both for being here this morning. Mr. Secretary, the past several weeks have been eventful for you and the department. You and have had your hands full as a CBP commissioner, and now you are responsible for ensuring the smooth functioning of the entire Department of Homeland Security. Your service as a career CBP employee brings an important credibility to your new position. Right now, this credibility is sorely needed, and it will be severely tested as you navigate your way through extremely controversial waters. Most of today's hearing will likely focus on immigration enforcement and the challenges at the border. Therefore, let me take a moment to recognize the dedication and the commitment of the men and women of the Department of Homeland Security who carry out the other vital missions that help protect the American public and our country from a wide range of threats. This includes DHS personnel who assist Americans following natural disasters, defend against cyber attacks, secure our airports, and investigate child exploitation and trafficking. The subcommittee will continue to work with you to ensure they have the resources that they need to carry out their important missions. This weekend's horrific terrorist attacks targeting religious minorities were a reminder that we must remain vigilant against the growing threat of domestic radicalization. I note that you recently announced the establishment of an Office of Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention. This office will help states and local communities counter the broad array of violent extremism in this country, including the growing threat from white nationalist groups. With regards to immigration enforcement and the challenges that we face at the border, my hope is we can work together to find a balance between protecting our borders and preserving our American values, which so far have been lacking in this administration. As we ensure the integrity of our borders, we must also treat immigrants with dignity and due process. And as we enforce immigration law, we must also use the discretion inherent in the law to prioritize enforcement efforts. We must also help facilitate the ability to enter the United States through legal means while understanding the devastating circumstances that often compel desperate people to seek safe haven any way they can. Above all, we must not demonize those who, like so many of our ancestors, came to this country to seek a better life. A few weeks ago, I, along with several other members and staff, traveled to El Paso and San Diego to see CBP and ICE operations. What we witnessed, to say the least, was extremely disturbing. We saw families waiting to be processed who were kept for hours in the hot sun or in crowded makeshift shelters. We saw dozens of single adults standing shoulder to shoulder in Border Patrol holding cells designed for only 10 to 12 people. I understand that the surge of migrant families is unprecedented, but it is not an excuse for the conditions that we saw. I am aware that you are working to improve those conditions, but people are suffering and improvements are not happening fast enough. Addressing the humanitarian crises in short term is in part a resource challenge, but it is also a challenge that requires a commitment by your department to respect the rights of immigrants and to treat them humanely. Unfortunately, that is not what I and other members of Congress see during our many oversight visits. I hope we can continue to work together to ensure this challenge is met. For the long term, we will need to find solutions that provide migrants with real alternatives to making the dangerous journey north. In the meantime, while ensuring due process for migrants, the timeline for adjudicating immigration cases must be reduced. Simply making it harder to claim asylum in the United States is not the answer. Furthermore, the migrant protection protocols do not achieve the balance that we need, and they are making it harder for migrants to seek asylum in the United States. And unfortunately, efforts to ensure the safety and civil rights of migrants so far appear to be only an afterthought. To make matters worse, just last night, the President directed you and the Attorney General to adjudicate all asylum applications within 180 days, except in exceptional circumstances, to require a fee for asylum applications and a fee for asylum seekers to receive work authorization, and to deny work authorization to asylum seekers who cross between the ports of entry. Mr. Secretary, as the head of the Department of Homeland Security, you will set the tone and establish the rules that will guide the department in meeting our shared goals of protecting our homeland and protecting our American values. I look forward to working with you and the members of the subcommittee to fairly, justly, and humanely address the challenges at our borders and the other many challenges facing the department across its many critical missions. The President's memo is another tragic step in the wrong direction. Now, before turning to the Acting Secretary for his summary of his written statement, the full text of which will be put into the hearing record, I would like to recognize our distinguished ranking member, Mr. Fleshman, for any remarks he may have.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and for everyone involved, I do want to thank you for the tremendous courtesies and civil and cordial way that we have been able to work on these issues. There's a lot of common ground, and there were some bona fide differences, but I thank you for all these courtesies. Thank you, Mr. McAleenan and Mr. Fulgham, for being with us here today, for meeting with us on the Department of Homeland Security's fiscal 2020 budget request. I also want to specifically, Mr. Secretary, thank you for stepping into this role and leading this department. There's a lot to consider in the entirety of the department's budget. I'm grateful that the chairwoman has held individual budget hearings with the individual agencies within the department as best as our schedule would allow. There's a lot of great work being done across the department. We've heard from the Coast Guard and the TSA. FEMA is later this afternoon, and CISA is tomorrow. We've had very informative meetings with ICE and CBP. It is clear that the people at the department are working every day to keep our country safe. Every leader from the department I've met with shares the same message. The people in their agencies are the most dedicated and committed to the mission of protecting our country. Please pass along our thanks for the work they're doing around the clock every day, sir. However, the situation we're seeing at our southwest border is really what's front and center these days. It is affecting the entire nation. It's pulling resources within the CPB, as we're seeing with wait times at the various types of ports within the department, and I'm sure that you are looking at reprogramming options. And I'm sure there aren't many. And across of all government from also high priorities. It's straining the resources and abilities of the NGOs in our country and in Mexico. It was the pin in the revolving negotiations around the partial shutdown of our federal government. I am hopeful that together, both sides of the aisle and both sides of the Capitol, we can come to an agreement and a solution. But this is a budget hearing, so focusing on the department's budget request of almost $52 billion in net discretionary funding, I think there's many places where we can agree. Resources for border security, technology, humanitarian aid, increases for cybersecurity and research, investment in the Coast Guard assets, and FTE investments to improve trade, travel, investigations, and enforcement. We all know the $5 billion requested for the physical border barrier will remain a challenge. We are up to it. Mr. Secretary, I think you have demonstrated a need for it. I look forward to your testimony on the department's proposed investments and initiatives, and I thank you for being here. Madam Chairwoman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Fleshman. And just a quick reminder to members that they will be called for questioning based on the seniority in which the hearing started. And also, please try and keep within the 5 minutes. We have a lot of questions, and I do appreciate the fact that the Secretary has agreed to stay longer than the 2 hours that we originally had scheduled. And now I would like to turn to the Chair of the Full Appropriations Committee, Ms. Nita Lowy.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. I'd like to thank Chairwoman Roybal Allard and Ranking Member Fleischman for holding this hearing. And I thank you, Mr. Secretary, and our witnesses for joining us today. The Department of Homeland Security's mission to secure our nation from consistent and pervasive threats is not an easy one, and I understand that. We know this all too well in New York. To keep us safe, different components within DHS must effectively coordinate and cooperate, all while working closely with other federal, state, and perhaps most importantly, local and tribal agencies. That is why the chaotic state of the Department of Homeland Security is so troubling. It seems like the car is driving off the cliff with no one to take the wheel, although I guess, Mr. Secretary, you are now the driver. Congratulations. It's even been reported that your predecessor, Secretary Nielsen, was so wary of angering President Trump that she tiptoed around addressing Russian hacking and interference in our elections so as not to ignite his no collusion anti-Mueller ire. I must tell you that issue keeps me awake at night, and I truly worry about it, and I hope it's a major focus of your work. I hope that when it comes to one of the biggest threats our country and democracy faces, you will focus on this with a laser beam. Your predecessor also instituted cruel and inhumane policies of ripping children from their families, which you helped implement. I want to be very, very clear, and I think it's important that we understand this on both sides of the aisle today. Ensuring the integrity of our borders and enforcing immigration is difficult, but necessary jobs, and we understand that. This administration's politicization of border security and heartless obsession with aggressive immigration enforcement are un-American and unacceptable. And you have an opportunity to turn it around and work with the Congress to humanely and ethically secure our borders. And we understand that we have to work together in a bipartisan way to secure our borders. Turning to fiscal year 2020, the budget request asks for an outrageous increase in ICE operations and support, including more than 1,000 additional ICE agents and support positions, and a large increase in detention beds. These increases leave too much flexibility for ICE to support this administration's overly aggressive interior enforcement policies. Democrats simply will not provide these dangerously high levels of detention for an agency that has remained opaque and whose enforcement tactics are unbalanced. ICE should prioritize removal efforts on those with serious criminal histories, not those who have lived and worked peacefully in our communities for decades, or those who are fleeing unspeakable violence in hopes of safety and a better future. The budget also proposes a large cut to the preparedness grants programs, including a $214 million decrease for the Urban Areas Security Initiative, which assists high-threat, high-density urban areas where the consequences of attacks would be most catastrophic. That also includes a $193 million cut to the State Homeland Security Grant Program, which enhances local law enforcement's ability to prevent and respond to acts of terrorism and other disasters. State and local jurisdictions, like those in my district, cannot effectively plan for the worst when support from their federal partner is inconsistent or insufficient. These programs need adequate funding to keep our communities safe. This committee, I want to assure you, is eager to support the department's essential and complex missions. But we cannot do that at the expense of state and local preparedness or our American values. So, Mr. Secretary, I look forward to a discussion today, and I thank you for being here. We will have a lively discussion, I'm sure. Thank you very much.
And now I would like to turn to the distinguished ranking member of the full committee, Ms. Granger.
Today to present the fiscal year 2020 budget for the Department of Homeland Security. You recently assumed an enormous responsibility as acting secretary of the department, but you're also assisted by a dedicated workforce working tirelessly to protect our nation, and I commend their efforts and your commitment to the department's mission. In my home state of Texas, we have a very important relationship with neighbors to our south. In many border towns and cities, our history and our economy, our families and our culture are very intertwined. And I've traveled to the southern border many times during my lifetime. Unfortunately, we have a humanitarian and security crisis on our hands, which I've been able to see for myself firsthand on two very recent trips to the border. The facts are undeniable, and the strain on our system is unsustainable. There are record-breaking numbers of people coming mainly from Central American countries, but also from places around the world. I was told on the last trip, 51 countries coming across, people coming across our southern border through Mexico to our border. Unauthorized border crossings are now at a 12-year high, you know that. More than 100,000 people come to the border. They came 100,000 people in March alone. That's compared to approximately 400,000 in all of last year. As more migrants claim asylum, the pressures on the system will continue to rise. Homeland Security agencies have a staggering workload, and the immigration courts, which are already facing a backlog of up to 5 years, will become even more overwhelmed. Unfortunately, members of this committee can't solve this problem with funding alone. We need policy solutions as well, and we have to work together with our colleagues on the authorizing committees to make changes to immigration laws. I hope members can come together in a bipartisan way to address these very difficult issues. I know you have decades of experience with Customs and Border Patrol, and we thank you for being willing to serve the country in this new role. Your insights were extremely helpful as we completed the fiscal year 2019 appropriations process, And we look forward to continuing that partnership as we make funding decisions for this year. I thank you, and I thank Madam Chairman. I yield back.
Okay, Mr. Secretary, on our trip to the border earlier this month, we witnessed migrants continuing to be held in inhumane conditions. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm so anxious to get to the questions because we have so many. Please continue with your opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Chairwoman Roybal Allard, Ranking Member Fleischman, full committee Chairwoman Nita Lowy, and Ranking Member Kay Granger. I appreciate the opportunity to testify before you today. It's a true honor to serve as the acting secretary and to represent the distinguished men and women of the Department of Homeland Security. In my view, DHS has the most compelling mission in government to safeguard the American people, our homeland, and our values. As acting secretary, I intend to work with this committee and serve as an advocate for the men and women of the department to ensure they have the resources they need to carry out critical missions on behalf of the American people. And today I have the privilege of presenting to you the President's fiscal year 2020 budget request for the Department of Homeland Security. The 2020 budget would strengthen the security of our nation through enhanced border security, immigration enforcement, cybersecurity, transportation security, counterterrorism, and resilience to disasters. With regard to border security, as you're all aware, we're in the midst of an ongoing security and humanitarian crisis at our southwest border. The department, at the request of our frontline officers and agents, has worked with this committee to make clear that we need additional resources to respond to the crisis. In March alone, CBP apprehended and encountered over 103,000 migrants crossing without legal status, the most in 1 month for over a decade. On April 16th, we had almost 5,000 people cross the border without authorization in a single day, almost 1,000 of them in just 3 large groups. Remarkably, these 3 large groups in one 24-hour period exceeded the total number of large groups apprehended in all of fiscal year 2017. Simply put, the system is full and we are well beyond our capacity. This means that the new waves of vulnerable populations arriving here and exacerbating the already urgent humanitarian security crisis at the border, we don't have room to hold them, we don't have the authority to remove them fairly and expeditiously, and they are not likely to be allowed to remain in the country at the end of their immigration proceedings. The status quo is not acceptable. Through supplemental requests and emergency declarations, we have worked to do everything to address the immediate and dire humanitarian crisis that we can. We've deployed medical teams from the U.S. Coast Guard. We've received help from the Department of Defense and Health and Human Services. We've redeployed CBP officers, and we've engaged with nonprofits across the country. But we do need more authorities, as the ranking member noted, and more resources to definitively address the crisis. We need sustained investment and additional emergency support at the southwest border to overcome the humanitarian and security crisis that we face. The President's budget requests $523 million to address the humanitarian crisis. This money will allow us to provide better care for those who we come in contact with through apprehension, care and custody, detention, and where appropriate, removal. Second, to address the border security crisis, it requests $5 billion in funding for the construction of approximately 200 miles of new border wall system. This is a proven deterrent that will enhance our ability to apprehend those entering our nation illegally. It also calls for 750 additional Border Patrol agents, 273 Customs and Border Protection officers, and over 1,660 ICE frontline and support personnel. It will also make much-needed upgrades to sensors, command and control systems, and aircraft to help our men and women combat criminals who are profiting from human suffering. I hear weekly from our operators on the border that these upgrades are badly needed in their fight against transnational criminal organizations, smugglers, and gangs. I would please ask for your support to our men and women who are doing heroic work along the border. While our 2020 budget will help address this crisis, we will need additional funding even sooner. Given the scale of what we're facing, we will exhaust our resources before the end of this fiscal year, which is why this week the administration will be sending a supplemental funding request to the Congress. As I'm sure you are only too aware, DHS is not the only agency involved in the humanitarian crisis unfolding daily at our southern border. Our partners at the Department of Health and Human Services are also on the brink of running out of resources. The administration's supplemental request will address critical humanitarian requirements and help ensure the crisis is managed in an operationally effective, humane, and safe manner. The administration's supplemental request will not only provide critical humanitarian assistance, including temporary and semi-permanent migrant processing facilities at the southern border, where families and children will receive timely and appropriate medical attention, food, and temporary shelter prior to being transferred to other residential locations, but also funding for border operations to include surge personnel expenses and increased detention capacity, and finally for mission support activities, including upgrades to our overtaxed information technology systems to manage and process migrants accurately, efficiently, and quickly. The supplemental request is part one. The second request will be the administration's legislative proposal, which will be sent to Congress shortly to address the key drivers of the humanitarian crisis. But even as we face a challenging border security and humanitarian crisis that is a central focus and my central task as acting secretary, DHS is always a multi-mission department, and we will not lose momentum across any of our key missions and the numerous efforts that we are facing, including, critically, cybersecurity, securing the 2020 elections, preparing for the upcoming hurricane season, and everything else that we're asked to do. The President's budget also requests $1.3 billion to assess evolving cybersecurity risks, protect federal government information systems and critical infrastructure. The budget supports the launch of Protect 2020, a new initiative designed to get all states to a baseline level of election infrastructure cybersecurity well before the national elections of 2020, building on the progress we made during the election season in 2018. While DHS does not control or directly oversee state and local election infrastructure, we can provide much-needed technical assistance and support to our willing partners. Our air travel system also needs to continue to evolve and upgrade in our security posture. Additional transportation security officers and technology will uphold our security effectiveness and stay ahead of increasing costs and security demands at airports nationwide. $3.3 billion requested for TSA includes funding for an additional 700 screeners and 350 computed tomography units. I want to close by reiterating that the strength of DHS is in its people. I would be remiss if I didn't mention the tremendous dedication of our frontline officers and agents confronting this crisis each day, and I appreciate the members of this committee going down to see our personnel, whether it's at the border, here, seeing our TSA at airports, just as you did yesterday, and really getting to know the challenges they face and the way they're tackling those challenges. Investment in our workforce is going to remain a very high priority for me. It was at CBP, it will during my tenure as acting secretary. I'm very glad the President's budget provides the necessary funding to accomplish our vital mission alongside funding retention and morale programs for our personnel. The resolve and devotion of the men and women of DHS is on display daily, and the security of our nation depends on appropriate resources to help them meet the newly challenging circumstances. As the committee knows, I'm 2.5 weeks into this role, so I'm joined at the table today by Acting Undersecretary Chip Fulgham, a tremendous professional who I've known for almost a decade, who has a multi-decade career of service, both in the United States Air Force as well as the Department of Homeland Security. He's doing this side by side with me in his last week at the Department of Homeland Security because he's committed to providing this committee with the information they need to understand our appropriations request and to effectively assess our budget. So I just want to thank you, Chip, for sitting next to me. I will definitely be relying on his expertise on multiple areas during our conversation today. So thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I look forward to the conversation this morning.
Mr. Secretary, as I mentioned in my opening statement, on our trip to the border earlier this month, we witnessed migrants continuing to be held in inhumane conditions. Well, we did witness CBP personnel trying to manage the flow and improve conditions where they could. We also saw many inefficiencies among departmental components that are continuing to provide delays in processing, transportation, and in improving conditions. What steps can be taken to improve efficiencies and the department's ability to quickly respond to changing conditions? And what is the role of the Interagency Border Emergency Cell that was established in April?
Thank you for the question. So I know you visited El Paso, Madam Chairwoman. This is our sector of the border that's had the most significant increase of any across the entire border, over a 400% increase in the arrivals of family units over last year. That has absolutely stretched our resources and our processes, both at CBP and across our interagency partners in the immigration system. And we're taking a number of steps to address that. First of all, we appreciate the committee's support in fiscal year 19 to provide additional funding to address the humanitarian challenges. That means facilities, transportation, medical care, and also food and other care and custody support for those in CBP custody. We're applying that funding. We're in the process of delivering a soft-sided temporary processing center that's going to allow our El Paso sector to put families and children who are arriving in a more appropriate setting during their initial processing at the border. That's absolutely critical. Our second step will be to upgrade that with a more modular and hard-sided facility. And then, of course, we'd like to establish a permanent central processing center in El Paso that would provide the appropriate setting for families and children with a whole range of services, from medical care to showers to laundry, and really allow us to have co-located partnerships with CIS, with Immigration and Customs Enforcement in one location. That's the goal. But we're starting with an immediate effort to provide a better setting in our soft-sided facilities. You asked how we can streamline these processes. I'd like to work on a unified immigration portal that will provide connection between the various systems of the agencies that oversee immigration and make sure that an individual being processed can be tracked throughout the system efficiently and in an expedited manner to both improve our processing and improve the integrity of the system. And then I mentioned the critical element of co-location. We're working closely, obviously, within the DHS family across the 3 immigration bureaus. Working with Health and Human Services has got to be a very streamlined process so that unaccompanied children spend as little time as possible at the border in a Border Patrol station or a related facility. But also working closely with our immigration courts at the Executive Office of Immigration Review. That we can do through improved communication, better IT systems, and a unified approach to this challenge. But we have a lot of work to do, as you've seen, and I'm personally committed to ensuring that the facility conditions are appropriate for those crossing the border.
Okay, and the role of the Interagency Border Emergency Cell is?
Sure. The main function of the IBEC it's the Interagency Border Emergency Cell, was to identify those interagency requirements to immediately respond to the humanitarian challenge at the border. So they've helped refine those exact same categories of needs: facilities, transportation, medical care. How do we get volunteers down to the border from other DHS components that have skill sets that we need? For instance, driver's license, commercial driver's license. When we have conveyances that we need to move migrants that are crossing, we don't always have the people to drive them. So simple things like that. We have attorneys surging to the border to help process expeditiously and fairly, as you noted, which is critical. And so they've developed those requirements, which we've gone to our interagency partners, including the Department of Defense, to help us meet in the near term.
Okay. And let me just say that, you know, the administration, you have for some time called upon Congress to take immediate action, and we have not received any requests from you in that regard. So I'm happy that you have stated that we will be receiving a request from you. And my time is up, and so I would like to turn it over to Mr. Fleischman.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Mr. McAleenan, much has been made about building a barrier across the southwest border of the country. So I have some very pointed questions. A barrier was not an invention of the previous Congress or even this current administration. Is that correct, sir?
That's correct.
How many miles of fence or barrier were constructed prior to January 2017, sir?
Approximately 654 miles.
Thank you, sir. The fiscal year 2018 Border Security Improvement Plan was mandated in the fiscal 18 appropriations bill. We've heard from you in your capacity as the commissioner of CBP that this plan was the result of the experiences and needs of agents and officers on the ground at the border. How was the plan created, and who had input to determine the priorities, sir?
Yeah, that's correct, Congressman. Our Border Security Improvement Plan is derived from the men and women in the field identifying those technologies and capabilities they need to enhance the security of the border in their areas. As you know from visiting us on the border, each area of the border has different challenges, both in terms of terrain, in terms of existing technology, in terms of what barriers we have. And so our sector chiefs on the Border Patrol side, our directors of field operations are putting their requirements forward for what they need in their areas of responsibility. We go through a rigorous process to assess and analyze those, to validate them, and then combine them before we submit the report to Congress on the Border Security Improvement Plan.
Yes, sir. So just to be abundantly clear, the input is coming from the men and women who are actually doing the work there on the ground, and that's what you are acting upon, sir.
That's correct.
Very good. Is CPB following the published 2018 Border Security Improvement Plan when determining where to invest construction funds?
Yes.
Any deviations?
I mean, that's our set of priorities that we're asking for funding against. And so that's going to be our guidepost.
Thank you. Is CBP following the restrictions in the fiscal 2019 bill placed on various sections of the border when determining where to invest construction funds?
Yes, very, very carefully. We'll be engaging in the consultation required. We'll be obviously mindful of those areas where we're not going to be able to build barrier at this time. But of course, we'll be following those restrictions.
So you have been following the fiscal 18 and fiscal 19 restrictions as laid out by the Congress?
Yes, Congressman.
Thank you, sir. So even though the president has transferred other funds, you're still following the priorities and plans in the published document and the restrictions of the fiscal 19 bill?
Yes, that is our intent.
Excellent. Thank you. I'm going to move to hiring then, sir. Staffing and retention initiatives are highlighted across many, if not almost all, the department's components in the 2020 budget request, with funds requested to back up increased numbers. For Customs and Border Protection, prior year budgets have also proposed increasing the amount of agents, just like this year, but the department hasn't been able to provide justification supporting the request. The committee directed the department to complete the long overdue staffing report by September of this year. Further, the IG has recently published reports highlighting other challenges CPB faces to onboarding a large number of people in a short period of time, such as training facility limitations and capacity issues in existing agency offices. I have a question, sir. Has the CBP made progress on a border agent staffing methodology, sir?
Yes, we have. The personnel requirements determination, as you noted, will be delivered to Congress by the end of this fiscal year.
Okay. Does the model you're developing support the request of 750 additional border agents in 2020, sir?
Yes, it'll support probably more than that, but that's the number that we believe we can hire within a fiscal year.
And one final question, how will the department resolve other issues of training and facility capacity to meet the influx of new hires?
Yeah, it's a close partnership between U.S. Customs and Border Protection and the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center. We've worked that out in our officer context where we're enjoying a very successful set of hiring 2,000 over the last 5 years, net CBP officers, and we're going to hire a net 1,000 or more this fiscal year. So we work to balance the classes at the FLETC Training Center, and we'll be doing that for the Border Patrol Academy as we seek to add additional agents as well.
Thank you, sir. And as I said in my opening statement, I want to thank you, Mr. Fulgham, and also the outstanding men and women who work in Homeland Security every day to keep our great nation safe. And with that, I will yield back.
Thank you.
Ms. Lowy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I want to welcome again the Secretary who's taking on a really important responsibility. Mr. Secretary, as you know, the Migrant Protection Protocols Program was put in place to return arriving migrants to Mexico while their immigration claims are processed. It's not clear to me how this program works, and DHS has only recently begun to provide limited details to Congress. This is despite the fact that the program has now expanded to other areas, and I understand El Paso is one of those areas. Given that the program is called Migrant Protection Protocols, how does the Department of Homeland Security coordinate with Mexico to ensure the safety and well-being of returned migrants? And will the Executive Office for Immigration Review prioritize these cases, or will migrants be forced to remain in Mexico for possibly years as they await adjudication of their cases?
Thank you for the question, Congresswoman. So the migrant protection protocols are an important effort to provide greater access to court hearings, and especially at our ports of entry, where we're working diligently to provide access to asylum seekers lawfully presenting without documents, but also to achieve a actual court resolution in a reasonable amount of time. This is something that I think is the fundamental challenge we face with the system right now, is actually getting results from an immigration proceeding that can be effectuated in a timely manner. What the migrant protection protocols allow us to do is two things. One, it allows us to take more people in at ports of entry who are presenting asylum claims, because we can process them without the limitations in our capacity from the custody requirements or from the non-detained docket for the Executive Office of Immigration Review. As you asked, will judges be dedicated to the migrant protection protocol? Yes, that's our commitment from DOJ, that they will be able to dedicate judges and dockets to the MPP to actually get through hearings in months instead of years before even an initial hearing as we currently face today. The other thing it will do is it will take away the incentive, which exists right now, to cross illegally instead of presenting lawfully at a port of entry. We have increased our asylum processing at ports of entry 120% from fiscal year 17 to 18, and we are up another 100% in fiscal year 19 over 17. We're on pace for over 70,000 asylum applications at ports of entry in this fiscal year. To keep up with that, we need to ensure that we provide access to a process. In terms of working with Mexico, we obviously had conversations before implementing this program. Mexico is a sovereign nation to receive people back. That is their decision. They made the decision to accept them and put public guarantees over protection from a humanitarian perspective, as well as access to legal counsel and access to return to the ports of entry to be brought to their court hearings.
So just to clarify, because I appreciate your answer, you're saying that even though they're being sent to Mexico, they will have and are having access to legal counsel?
So each migrant and each asylum applicant is given a list of legal providers that are available in many of these areas, and the main implementation, as you noted, is both in Baja California, or Tijuana primarily, as well as Juarez, Chihuahua. We have U.S. attorneys and non-governmental organizations that have binational presence and collaboration. And so we make sure they know who they can call if they don't already have an attorney identified. And they have that opportunity to also meet with their counsel when they come into the U.S. Before their hearing as well.
I would appreciate additional information as to how that process is working and whether you think it's effective and whether most or all of the migrants do have legal counsel. I'd appreciate that. The zero tolerance policy instituted by the Trump administration led to the separation of thousands of families. And while this inhumane policy technically ended last June, as I understand it, CBP continues to separate some children from their families. I know you describe family separation as not worth it, but can you explain the circumstances under which CBP will separate child from a parent, legal guardian, or someone claiming that relationship? Oh, maybe you can just answer that. I see I run out of time. Please answer.
Yes, thank you. So the conditions where a child might be separated from a lawful parent or guardian at this time are extraordinarily rare. It's happening for less than 2 per day, even though we have 1,600 plus families arriving per day. These conditions are prescribed both in the executive order from June 20th of last year, as well as the Miss L case court order, and they are for the safety and welfare of the child. A communicable disease, a serious criminal history, a risk presented by that adult to the child. And so it's being done very carefully, in extraordinarily rare circumstances, and that's the only time a separation occurs. The other part of your question, though, is when a family member crosses with a child. Under the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act, a family unit is defined as a parent or guardian, not necessarily just another family member. So in those cases, we do have to treat the child as unaccompanied as well under the law.
To be continued. I know I've ran out of time. Thank you, sir.
Ms. Granger.
Thank you. Because of the sheer volume of people coming to the border to claim asylum and the resulting strain on the immigration system, record numbers of migrants are being released into the United States with court dates and directions to check in with their local ICE offices. Many of them completely ignore those instructions. I heard on one trip to the border that monitoring bracelets were removed as soon as the migrants left law enforcement custody in many cases. We've invested billions of dollars in alternatives to detention. I'd ask you, do these programs work? Which ones of them work? Does ICE have the resources to deal with the number of immigrants, both in terms of those presenting at the border and tracking people going through the asylum process? While this issue is mainly in the jurisdiction of the Department of Justice, do you have suggestions on how the immigration courts could speed up the processing and reduce their backlog?
Thank you, Congresswoman. There's several important questions there. First of all, that's going to be an area that I look at very carefully, along with the Acting Director of ICE, Matt Albans. How can we make our alternatives to detention effective for ensuring that people do present for their court hearings and that those results that immigration judges eventually find can be appropriately effectuated? We do not have that process working effectively right now, as you noted. We are very concerned about people cutting off their bracelets and not showing up for court hearings. That's not a process with integrity right now. We do recognize the committee's provision of additional resources in fiscal year 19 to look at a case management program in a renewed light for families that would maybe help us ensure people actually go through the process in an expedited manner. One of the things I'll be talking about with Attorney General Barr and James McHenry, who oversees the Executive Office of Immigration Review, is how we can move people through a non-detained docket for those recent border arrivals in an effective manner. That's absolutely critical. But in terms of your broader point, the way that we are actually achieving results is when we are able to detain someone in custody through the pendency of their immigration proceedings. That's what works with single adults right now, and that's an essential aspect of what we're going to be asking for from Congress for families, being able to keep them together in an appropriate setting for a fair and expeditious process. That's going to be how we establish integrity for that group of border crossers as well.
And I think all of us that are on this subcommittee and all the members of Congress, we realize that there were good processes put together at some time. The sheer numbers today, we have new process and changes laws that are going to be very important. I was on the border on one of the trips recently, and the person that was working so hard and said, you know, what we need is a permanent structure of this. And I said, no, we don't need a permanent structure because we can't do this permanently. The numbers are so overwhelming. The Customs and Border Patrol, they're like our military. They say, we'll do whatever with whatever you give us. Well, they don't say that anymore because they can't do it. And so we really, all of us need to work together with you and all that are trying to figure this thing out and how we stop those sheer numbers and how we deal with it as we go. I've got a little bit of more time. How would you've had such a long experience with this issue, how are you seeing the changes occur? And I go back to far before this started, something that we were watching so carefully, to back to 2014 when Speaker Boehner asked me to go to the border and see these unaccompanied children and what was happening there and make recommendations. That's when we made recommendations, and I went to all three of the countries they were coming from and asked questions of the administrations there. And I said, do you want your children back, first of all? How much do you want your children back? And then what can you do in these countries to make them safer so that parents don't take their children to a country that they've never been to or pay someone that they've never met before. So how are you seeing this increasing from that time? And also, just in the last 6 to 8 months?
So there's been a number of changes. I mean, from that first year of crisis with unaccompanied children and family units, I was Deputy Commissioner of U.S. Customs and Border Protection at the time. And I think the main challenge we're facing is just the growing awareness and the exploitation of that awareness by smugglers of the weaknesses in our immigration laws and our system. We're seeing smugglers advertise differentiated offerings for getting to our border in an expedited time, making very clear that if people cross with a child, they're going to be allowed a different process here in the U.S. And that's been an invitational posture for the system that's been overwhelming, as you note. I would commend to the committee the recent Homeland Security Advisory Council report just 2 weeks ago. This is a bipartisan group of experts who wrote a nonpartisan report that outlined the crisis we're facing, the difficulty with facilities and just sheer volume and processing, but also very clearly legislative solutions that would address both the families and children crossing, as well as partnering with Central American countries to create greater integrity from the beginning of that process forward. So I think that's a very good set of external recommendations that really, in my view, accord with what we're seeing on the border.
Thank you for reminding us of that.